So I'm going to go ahead and overview the objectives for Chapter 1. And these are meant to really just help guide you. It's good to look these over before you start reading so that you get a good sense of what material you're going to be covering, kind of what to keep an eye out for. And then these are going to be great for you to use to study for the tests. You can take this, you can cut and paste from it, and you can write your answers in underneath each point, and then you have a nice sort of rubric that you can use as a study guide for the exam. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to briefly go over each one and just making sure that I'm covering the main topics that are going to be in the chapter. So Chapter 1 is stress and health. We're going to start by just explaining what stress is, what's a good definition of stress, and distinguishing between eustress, that good stress that pushes us and motivates us to do things, and then distress, which is the part that we don't like, which is something that causes a lot of anxiety and tends to upset us. You're going to get a little more familiar with ways of measuring stress. One of the most popular ways is the Social Readjustment Rating Scale. You're actually going to be taking a look at this in the discussion posting for the week. You're going to be evaluating your own stress using this scale. But the scale looks at the role of both hassles and uplifts. So hassles are like the daily things that we deal with that go wrong, like waiting in line or sitting in traffic or somebody cutting you off, paying bills. These are all hassles we go through every day of our lives. And then there's uplifts, things that happen that are good. Somebody gives you a ride to work. Somebody gives you a compliment. You have a good day at work. You have a reduced workload, whatever it might be, something that uplifts you in your stress experience. So once we're familiar with measuring stress and how do we rate it, and again, these are self-rated, right? You're looking at your own self-behavior. Then we can start to understand how people view their stress. And here's where we really get into individual differences with stress. I mean, you could have the same stressful experience, and not everybody is going to experience that the same, okay? So, you could have loss of a job, and depending upon the person, it could go many different ways of how that stressor has an effect on the person. So what comes into play are cognitive appraisals, how we think about our stress, the meaning that we give it, whether it's something that's going to make us or something that's going to break us. And this is an approach that causes the individual to think about the situation and maybe also think about the resources that they have to cope with the situation. And during that appraisal process, we're going to think about something as a threat or a challenge. And if you have a threat approach, you're going to see it as bad and something to be avoided. And if you see it as a challenge approach, you might think, no, I can do this, and you're going to rise to the occasion. So just the way that you appraise the stress can totally change the trajectory of where you take that stress. And so each appraisal has its own core relational meaning, which was something that was posed by Lazarus. And it's just our kind of natural emotional responses and the patterns that we develop in our emotional responses, which include our appraisals to stress. So you're going to be getting familiar with that process that people use. And then we're going to touch a little bit on some health psych concepts. We're going to talk about the biomedical model and the biopsychosocial models of health. We have focused in the past in our Western medicine very much so on the biomedical approach. That's science, that's microscopes, that's cells, that's everything that we think of when we think of modern medicine. But in the traditional biomedical model, the sick individual is often seen as a victim of unfortunate circumstances, whereas in the biopsychosocial model, the sick person might be seen as a victim, but also viewed as having contributed maybe to the illness through engaging in some kind of unhealthy behaviors. Biopsychosocial model takes into consideration everything, not just the biology of the person, genetics, but their psyche as well as their social constraints, social situations. So the biopsychosocial model is the preferred model of health. It's the one we subscribe to today in medicine, and it's a little more all-encompassing in the way that it views health, as well as how it also takes a global approach to wellness and well-being, physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. And so we'll be talking a lot about that model as we go through the chapters. And so then we'll be looking a little bit at how the field of health psychology and then behavioral medicine differ. These are two main kind of offshoots of medicine. You've got health psych in one branch, and then you've got behavioral medicine in the other. How do they differ? What do they share in common? And what are the roles of wellness and health? Then we come to one of the first models that we're going to talk about when we talk about stress, and that's Antonovsky's salutogenic model of health, which has some various components. Basically, it uses health as a sort of on a continuum. So it's a continuum approach, and it's used by proponents of the biopsychosocial model. And it doesn't, see people as diseased, healthy. So that dichotomous relationship of either you have illness and you're diseased or you're healthy. It sees people as on a continuum. They can fall anywhere from being ill to being healthy, but there's everything in between. And so this is a really popular model that doesn't view stressors as necessarily bad, but as factors that create tension. And this is interesting because as we start getting into the upside of stress, the other book that you're going to be reading along with the class, you're going to see that this is a key sort of idea that stress isn't inherently pathogenic. So depending upon how we manage the tension in our lives, how we mitigate stress, the outcome might move the person towards entropic, ends, which is one end of the continuum, or to the salutary end, which is a little more benefit to health, more of a benefit to health. And that's what Antonovsky is talking about with this model. And he suggests really that it's all about our adaptation to how we deal with stress. What kinds of things do we do to cope with our stress? And so he gets into how it impacts, how stress impacts our health and how it impacts our performance and all of that. Then we're going to take a look at what's called the Yerkes-Dodson curve, which basically tries to explain the physiological arousal and excitement that we might feel in a certain task, the level of stress and the level of arousal that we might have during a task that we're doing or a stressor that we're facing. And excitement's good. It can push us to get things done, like eustress. It can be a good thing, but when it's not, when we get bored or we see it as something that's not pushing us towards ultimate performance, then it could actually be bad. We could become overwhelmed by it. And here's where we get into like burnout, which we're going to talk about in a later chapter when we talk about job stress. It could go towards that end of the curve. Then we'll spend a little bit of time on the impact of stress and lifestyle on longevity. How long we live and how healthy we are is greatly mediated by the stressors we face and the type of lifestyle we live that goes along with that. We'll look at Cannon's fight or flight stress response and its effect on our physiology during stress. So when we are experiencing something stressful, how are our bodily systems activated? What are the various stages of GAS? Alarm resistance exhaustion. What is our body doing in those stages as it is dealing with a stressor? So this is a model that talks about when we are under stress, what's happening physiologically to us. So that's the GAS, Cannon's fight or flight. You've probably heard of this. This is pretty popular in intro psych. You learn a little bit about this. Again, physiology as well, what bodily systems are affected. So the two kind of go hand in hand. Fight or flight is sort of how we respond. Do we stay and try to fight the stressor and fight it and work at it? Or do we flee and avoid it? So avoidance coping, right, would be like the flight response. And then general adaptation syndrome is what's going on during that. So we'll be taking a good look at that. And then getting to Lazarus a little more in depth with Lazarus appraisals and coping models. So he talks a lot about the different phases of appraisal, primary and secondary, what occurs during those, and what's the role of self-efficacy. That was originally proposed by Bandura, but it plays a big role in whether or not we think we can deal with the stressors we're facing. If we don't think we can deal with them, we're probably going to have poor coping strategies. If we think we can deal with them, we might employ more effective coping strategies. And so this affects obviously the outcome of the stressor that we're facing. So we'll get a little more in depth with those. And then lastly, positive psychology. So the chapter just ends with a little blurb on positive psych, and that's really to just introduce you to it, because in the next chapter, chapter 2, you'll be exploring positive psych much more in depth. And it really is a fun area that goes along with stress. It's a way of taking stress and spinning it in a positive realm, sort of the glass half full outlook. And what does that do for us? What does that do for our minds and our bodies and our orientation to life, our approach to challenges, and all of that good stuff. So that gives you a little rundown of the chapter. Again, I just want to stress that at any point as you're going through the chapter, if you're having trouble on a concept or need a little more explanation, please feel free to reach out, because again, I can do little mini lecture bursts on a topic that you're having trouble with, and I would love to do that and post those for you. If you're having trouble with Antonovsky's model, what I can do is, just go over some of the slides on that, talk a little bit more about it, give some more examples. So anytime that you're needing that, please let me know. But in addition to these objectives, what I'd also like you paying attention to in your book is at the end of every chapter, there are critical thinking questions. And these are great questions. Some of them I will be using in our discussion posts each week, but I won't be using all of them. There's usually about like 4 to 5, and I might pick 1 or 2 as discussion questions. You should be answering the other ones on your own, just because they help you to make sure you're really understanding the material and how it relates to one another, how the concepts mesh and go together and play off of one another. So I think it will help facilitate a much deeper understanding of the material and, stimulate some thinking on your part of how you might integrate some of this into your life with stress management. Okay, so that's it. Again, please just let me know if you have any questions.